my friend Mike Goodman has said that there's two kinds of national teams. There's the national team where the fans are mad at the team and they don't realize it, but they're mad at the team because the players aren't as good as they want them to be. And then there's the other group, which the fans are mad that all their good players aren't playing as well as they want them to be. And I think the U.S. was, for most of its history, in the first category. And I think they now are potentially in the second category.
Welcome to another episode of the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host, and my guest on this episode is Ryan O'Hanlon of ESPN. He has just published his new book, Net Gains, which is on soccer and analytics. In this episode, we talk about his new book, which includes what is the best way to play the game. We get into the World Cup, and Ryan tells us about who he thinks is the favorite and also a dark horse team that could win the entire tournament. And then we also talk about the U.S. men's national team and their prospects in a group with England, Wales, and Iran. The Football Analytics Show is brought to you by the Power Ranks Sports Betting Newsletter. This is a free service that strives to be three things. 1, valuable. 2, concise. 3, entertaining. In this newsletter, I write about college football and NFL bets that I made, and also I send out a curated list of sports betting tips and news every Saturday morning. Over the next month, I will also be sending out betting newsletters about the World Cup. To check it out, go to thepowerrank.com. That is my site for better sports betting information through data and analytics. Once again, that's thepowerrank.com. Joining me on this episode of the Football Analytics Show is Ryan O'Hanlon. He is the author of the new book, Net Gains, and he is a writer for ESPN. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I guess it's the other football analytics show today.
You know, when it is that time of year, when there's World Cup or important things going on, I just say it's just football. We're just talking the Football Analytics Show. So
yeah, it's accurate, not inaccurate.
Yep.
So
absolutely. Ryan, would love to know more about your story. How did you get into sports, writing, and in particular, like how did your playing career impact your future career?
Yeah, so I grew up playing soccer on Long Island. My grandfather was German heritage, and he played when he was even still playing a little bit when I was a kid. So that's kind of how I got into it, through him. It turned out I was pretty good. Was a lot better at soccer than other sports. I remember I was on like a travel baseball team, and when I was, I don't know, like 11 or something, and all the teams nearby we would play. And we would win easily. And then we play like this team in the playoffs, and I saw a curveball for the first time. And that was the last game I ever played. I was like, this is just not, that's not going to happen. So I think actually like right around then, around 11 or 12, I like specialized in soccer, which I think is actually a thing the research suggests is maybe not actually what you should do if you want to maximize your sort of athletic ability, even though that's kind of counterintuitive. But at the time, I was like one of the few people who like specialized as a kid, right? So I think that probably worked to my advantage, if I had to guess, maybe a little bit. So played competitive soccer, eventually got recruited by a bunch of Division I schools. I went to Holy Cross, had a incredibly unfulfilling 4-year experience at Holy Cross. My claim to fame is I scored in overtime against Boston College, who they had Alejandro Bedoya was their best player, started for the U.S. at the 2014 World Cup. So we beat them in overtime. Boston College and Holy Cross are like longtime rivals, even though it's not really a rivalry because Boston College has way more money to put into their athletic department. But anyway,
Sure. Yep.
while doing that, going into school, I kind of wanted to get into like writing in some form. I was an English major, creative writing, nonfiction major. So I was doing that while I was playing soccer. And, started writing for a couple websites out of college, got like a full-time editing job for this website called the Good Men Project back in 2010, I think. 2010. That's when I graduated. Kind of bounced around from there, worked a bunch of kind of magazine editing jobs, eventually found my way to Grantland, which you were a contributor to at points, I believe, right?
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
And so I had done a little freelance soccer writing for them while I was a magazine editor, and then they hired me as an editor. And, so you're working at Grantland, kind of the best sports writing, I think, right? It was the best combination of like romantic literary writing combined with like being able to weave in analytical thought, right? And new ways to kind of understand the game and sort of evidence-based analysis, right? So, I work there, and it's like I find all of that stuff fascinating, and I'm like, but like soccer, like this is absent from soccer. Like this kind of writing is absent. We had Mike Goodman. He was one of our writers who wrote about soccer in this way, but it was still not because of Mike's inabilities as a writer, but it was still like, it felt like it was 15 years behind the conversations we were having in other sports, right? We're still arguing over, whether, randomness affects the outcome of a soccer game kind of thing. And so I kind of go for it.
About that time, like it was like we were still in this era where like soccer was kind of taking things from hockey, right? Mm-hmm. And there was this discovery like shots was a better predictor of future goals than current goals. I think that's probably around that era, if I'm right, like 2012-ish.
Yep. Yeah. So we're talking shots are a better predictor than goals. Like, arguments over like, I feel like it was a Tottenham team that their sort of approach was purely like shot based. Like we want to shoot more than the opposition. And it kind of that it's funny because that's like that team was an example of, what's the term when you like try to produce the metric, it ceases to become a valuable metric. There's like a term for it. I forget. Seth Partnow always talks about this. But they were like an example of the limitations of that, right? So it's like you have people showing that shots are really important, but then you have this Tottenham team that's taking all those shots and they're like not doing as well. And it's like, so your shots aren't so good, buddy, anymore, right? Like, so that was kind of the era then. And so to me, I kind of felt like it was like a cheat code or like not a cheat code, but like I had a time machine almost, right? Because it's like you saw what happened in baseball, like for lack of a better term, the nerds won, right? We'll just use that phrasing. Basketball, that was right around when the Warriors were kind of coming into prominence, shooting a ton of threes. This sort of traditional center was being phased out of the sport. And then even in the NFL, passing was starting to become just a higher percentage of the plays in a game. And back then, the kind of fourth down stuff was not really the big thing back then was, I guess, Belichick going for on fourth down against the Colts in that one game and failing. And but
the epic ripple that it created in the sports media landscape.
Yeah, it set back football for like a decade because then no one wanted to go for it on fourth down. So you kind of see it like I saw it happen. You see it happen in baseball, then you see it happening in basketball, just like 10 years removed, and then it's kind of happening in the NFL. So with soccer, I kind of just felt like this is just gonna happen in soccer, right? Like it's to some degree, like and you see the pushback from the kind of traditional fans, the traditional football men, as they're called. So I kind of just like it was a weird situation where I was like, yeah, this is just going to happen. And I know it's going to happen, but like most of the people in the world, I don't think are aware that this is going to happen. Then I kind of started writing a bit more about soccer. Eventually Grantland folds. I go to the Ringer. I'm an editor there, but I'm basically our like staff soccer writer at the same time. So I'm doing that, writing a ton more. And then eventually I leave the Ringer after the 2018 World Cup, and I kind of was a little burnt out from working on the internet, just pretty high paced stuff. And the idea of writing a book
Sure.
had always, it appealed to me in opposition to that, right? Because in a book, you take your time. It's like a long, slow burn of putting the book together, writing the book, and even writing, right? You can go off on all these tangents, and there's plenty of tangents in the book, which some of which I'm sure we'll get into. But
Absolutely. Yep.
that very much appealed to me, and I kind of threw some ideas at my agent, and my agent was like, "What if you just like write about like everything?" I had some like
Mm-hmm.
specific ideas about maybe a specific team, right? And then you hang the analytics story on them. But my agent was kind of like, "No, just like pick all the interesting stuff out there and like weave it all together in a book." And so I was like, okay, like it does kind of feel like not that my entire life has been leading me to write this book, but all these different things I did in my life, played soccer, was an editor, kind of seeing all these other sports come together, and then sort of churning out all this writing to kind of like build myself up to be able to write a book. Felt like it all kind of came to a head, and writing this book was kind of the logical next step. As does that answer your question in any way?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like, you started as an editor, and I presume that was like the easier way to get your foot in the door when you were starting out after college. But really, your passion for the sport and your interest in the analytics side of things drove you to maybe drop the editing part a little bit and get more into the writing side, which you now also do for ESPN as well, right? And then write this book.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's true. And I think the other thing is that like when I started out, like being an editor was a much different thing, right? Like you could work as an editor at a magazine, and you're working on say 5 stories at once, right? For various issues. And it's kind of like, it's a nice pace, and you can still find some time to do some writing in addition to being an editor. And then like from 2010 to 2018, like magazines kind of start to disappear.
Yeah.
Everything goes web-based, and being an editor now is much more about like just a constant churning of stuff, like making sure all the right beats are getting covered. So it became a different thing that was way less appealing to me. Yeah. So
no, absolutely. I mean, I worked a lot with Mallory Rubin at Grantland.
she's the best.
And yeah, and Mallory's awesome, and it was, I mean, just seeing how hard she worked and the type of work ethic that she had to put in
Yeah.
to keep pace with everything that was going on was pretty incredible. And I feel like that's just part of the internet, right? Like the constant what do you like, the content treadmill? What's the word for it? Yeah.
That sounds right to me.
Yeah. So, I mean, you constantly have to kind of feed that beast. And I guess that gets overwhelming is what you're saying.
Yeah. And it's harder to, right? It's like, so when I worked at magazines, right, the editing process, like, I don't know, the average person probably doesn't understand, like you're like rewriting a lot of the pieces and asking for big changes and kind of like digging into it pretty aggressively. And then at Grantland, we kind of did do that a lot of times with our editing, because the site kind of published in a daily magazine style, right? We weren't like reacting to news like that in the moment. We were kind of just publishing everything in the morning, basically. But then as the velocity of what you're publishing changes, right? The actual like word sentence based, back and forth editing you do kind of disappears, and the editing job becomes more of like a, spinning plates or whatever, and making sure that you have the right plates spinning. Right. So it's a very different job now, I think had a lot less of an appeal to me.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So you write this book, Net Gains. I've read the book. I loved it. I love the sport. I love analytics. And you tell a lot of awesome, amazing stories in there. And I would highly recommend it to anyone listening to this pod. For you, what were the most interesting things that you learned through this book project?
I think what made me want to write the book, and what I think makes the book interesting and worth writing about something that is constantly changing, like it's sort of like a history of a history that's still happening, right? That's like one relatively accurate way to describe this. It's not like Moneyball, which is just like the Billy Bean story, right? Right. It's all these different things. And I think what made me want to write it and what made it like a rewarding thing to write, or a thing that like a lot of editors will tell you, like, if you have a book idea, it might sound like a good idea, but like you don't know if you're going to hate yourself when you like try to spend 3 years of your life writing it.
Right.
What made this not feel this way is like, it's kind of this two-pronged, like, so there's two things at play, right? There's the kind of cultural, why is the sport resistant to embracing analytics, whatever you want to call it, data, evidence-based decision-making, or even just like alternative ways of finding wins or whatever. And then there's the other part, which is like, it's really freaking hard to measure the sport in any way, and then like derive any kind of value-based metrics, I guess, from the sport. And so I think that is what makes soccer unique compared to the other sports. And that's what those two things happening at the same time is what is kind of the driving, I guess, tension of the book, and that made it a really interesting thing to dig into. I don't know, the most interesting thing. So I don't know. I'm interested in the possibility that there's just like a totally different, better way to play soccer, right? Like I'm interested in that for all sports, right? Like, would just a completely radical approach to things that's totally different from the way everyone else is doing it. Is there a chance that like that is a path to success for teams? And so I talked to Sarah Rudd, who was the former head of analytics at Arsenal. And she said to me, she was like, so like start working for Arsenal, and we have our own sort of in-house data company. Basically, we record our own like bespoke data. And she was like, everyone always like talked about thirds. Like there is the attacking third, there is the midfield third, and there is the defensive third. And in my head, I was like, why? Like, why are there thirds? Like what? That just seems incredibly arbitrary. So she was like, okay, if that's arbitrary, perhaps I can find a new way to sort of define the geography of the field. And if I do that, maybe I can then like, I have this new lens into looking at the game, and maybe that's going to allow me to like unearth something about the game, right? Because I'm looking at it in this perspective that is not hindered into the division of the field. And she was like, so I kind of just like removed myself from the thirds, and I just tried to sort of collect data in a way that didn't use like thirds to define anything. And she was like, but what you figure out is that like there actually are thirds to the field, and like the way defenders organize themselves, and like with where the box is, where the penalty area is, and where the defenders usually want to sort of set their defensive line, that's actually just like accurate. That's how how soccer works. It wasn't wrong. Yeah. So I think that, you know, that's not like a groundbreaking piece of information, but I think that almost gets at kind of what I was saying, where it's like, go for it.
Yeah, I guess I think it is a little groundbreaking, right? Because it's such a fluid game, and you talk about why the game is hard, because it's fluid, and you know, like the managers don't have as much of effect because they're not out there making decisions for the players. And I think it's actually pretty interesting that the data naturally breaks itself up into thirds of the field. Because I mean, Sarah was the one that started doing like the Markov chain analysis, trying to figure out the value of a pass, right?
Yep.
And you can certainly think that, you know, from that analysis, it doesn't naturally break itself into thirds. It's almost like a continuum, right? So, yeah, I don't know. I think that's kind of interesting that the sport naturally breaks itself up into thirds.
It's interesting to someone like you and like someone like me, but if I just said this to like your average soccer fan, they would be like, "That's not interesting. Everyone knows that it's thirds." You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, we can blame Johan Cruyff for that, right? And his 4-3-3, and
yes, it's his fault.
Yeah. All right, so Ryan, let's dig into this. I was going to save this till the end, but is there a best way to play, right? You actually, in the beginning of the book, you tell the story about how in your development, right, you were just dominating soccer, and that's because as a 12-year-old, you could just lob the ball over the keeper's head, and 11-year-old keepers can't jump. I see this all the time. But then things changed because you were like, oh, well, there's a better way to train, and your dad got you into a different type of coaching, which inevitably ends up being a Dutch person, because
Of course.
the Dutch innovated a lot of everything, and Johan Cruyff was at the beginning of that. And when I watch youth soccer today, there's this dichotomy between the teams that want to play the Dutch way. They want to pass, they want to possess the ball. And people like me who strongly believe in this, believe that this is the only way to raise young children to play the game, to have the technical skill, to be able to play at the highest level. And then there's the opposition, which is, the teams that rely on their athleticism and they just want to run at you. They don't care as much about the technical skill. So, think about, the first one is kind of your quintessential Barcelona teams with Xavi and Iniesta and Messi. And then your second teams, if I may pick on them, is, kind of your lower level Premier League team.
Sure.
So basically
Burnley
teams that are not.
would be
Burnley.
The stereotype that comes to people's minds.
You've probably dug into this more than anyone. Like, do we have an answer to the best way to play?
So I think it's interesting to think about it from a youth perspective to start, because I would argue that at the youth level, like, what are you trying to achieve, right? Are you trying to win games? I don't think that is the main priority. And I think all of the countries that are best at producing talent are way less focused on winning games. That's kind of like how England has suddenly started developing all of these talented players that are less focused on winning games. France, came out and said, yeah, we don't we play less competitive games at the youth level, and France is as good at developing talent as anyone. And the Ajax in the Netherlands, same thing. So from that perspective, yeah, I think at a youth level, like, there's a huge benefit from trying to play the Dutch style, right? Because it forces you to develop all of these tight area skills, right? That allow you to then, it sort of opens up a new level of the game. Because you have to, basically the less you have to think about controlling the ball, the more you're capable of achieving on the field, right? Because you can kind of have your head up and you can kind of see the field more, and you can think about where the ball is going to go before you get there, because you don't have to think about, oh my God, how do I control the ball? And then how do I move away from the defender and open up space? That just becomes natural. So I think at a youth level, I'm very much pro sort of emphasizing the Dutch style, because I don't think as a kid learning how to play a vertical athletic based style does anything, because your athleticism is going to drastically change by the time you become older. So that being said, I think it's a very contentious issue at the professional level. And I think, so I just wrote an article today, actually, about Leeds, who are coached by Jesse Marsh, who's an American. He first coached at all of the Red Bull teams. So Red Bull owns, if people don't know, Red Bull basically have bought up a bunch of soccer teams and very quickly turned them into some of the best teams in the world in the span of about 15 years. Because basically the way they play is you try to win the ball as high up the field as you can. And then when you win the ball, you try to play it as quickly forward as possible, because if you're winning the ball from the other team, it means you're winning the ball while they're not in their defensive structure. They're in their attacking structure. So there will be gaps when you win the ball. And then you try to play it through them as quickly as possible to take advantage of that space. And you're also willing to play quickly because you're good at winning the ball back. So you're basically, it's this virtuous cycle where you're trying to, you win the ball, you try a very high risk pass, but you're okay with the pass not coming off because you're so good at winning the ball back, basically. And that style also, though, forces you to push super high up the field and inevitably leads to a handful of terrible looking goals, right? The press sometimes gets broken down, and then it's just a 3-on-1 with your center back against their attackers, and you'll lose a game where you have a lot of the ball, but the other team gets 2 very easy opportunities, and everyone kind of looks at you like you don't know what you're doing, right? And that reminds me of kind of the fourth down thing in the NFL, right? Over the long run, you are betting, and you probably have evidence somewhere, data that suggests that over the long run, we're going to concede fewer goals and we're going to score more, even if in the short term it can fail. And I think that's basically right the bet you're making with going for on fourth down. Like your punt's probably not going to get blocked and your field goal is more likely to be converted. But by doing those things doing those things, you're actually making yourself less likely to win. So that Red Bull style is kind of like, it's like let's call it a evolved version of the stereotypical style you described, right? Because it's not just hitting long balls, right? It's pressing super high up the field and then playing very aggressive attacking passes. So I think, like, to me, that for most teams at the highest level, I think that is, if I had to put my money on there being a sort of most plus EV, let's say, way of playing, I think that's it. Because I think it's way easier. One, I think just soccer athletes are better than they were, 15 years ago, because more people are playing soccer, basically. And so it's easier to find players that can kind of run and attempt very difficult passes and then run again when they lose the ball. I think it's easier to find those players than someone like, say, Kevin De Bruyne, who is has incredible vision and can like break down a set defense because he's just, like, to oversimplify things, incredibly good at kicking a soccer ball, basically. So I think for most teams, that pressing style, my guess is that is the best. That would lead to a lot of bad looking results, but in the long run, I think it would lead to it would win you more points than playing a sort of, let's kind of try to counter and sit back, or let's try to like pass the ball around in our own half and dominate possession. So yeah, that would be my theory. But I think the interesting thing is, like, the theory then depends on what the other team is trying to do, right? Like, so if everyone else is just trying to play the pressing style, are you then incentivized to do something else?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Are you incentivized to get center backs that have extraordinary skill and can get the ball to the midfielders? So actually, I want to clarify one thing. So this Marsh style, what Leeds United's doing, you would suggest that maybe it's somewhat at odds with the Dutch style of possessing the ball and controlling it. Is that roughly right? Obviously, it's not black and white, but
I would say it's a melding of the two, because you can go back and watch clips of Cruyff's Dutch teams, and the way that they press is like, it's like the most psychotic thing you'll ever see. It's literally like, I as your kids play, you've seen the phenomenon of every single player on the field converging on the ball, basically.
Right. Yeah, the swarm.
They would basically do that when they lose the ball. Like the like distance between their like striker and their center back at times would be like maybe 10 yards on a 110 yard field. So this is kind of like, it is adopting that style, and it's adopting the Dutch idea of like control, right? But I think the control you're looking for here is controlling the territory on the field. You're not as worried about controlling the ball itself. You're worried about controlling where the ball is. So I think it's kind of a melding of those styles, basically.
Right. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because I would say that Man City is probably the best at doing this, right? In terms of pressing up the field. And they're obviously very skilled as well, but they're skilled to try to score goals. And this comes from Pep Guardiola, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Man City yes, they are good at winning the ball high up the field, but then when they win it, they play relatively slowly and control the game. While I think Liverpool, not this year, but in years past, they were kind of, they were even better at winning the ball high up the field, but they would play a lot more aggressively as soon as they won the ball. So I think pressing, all the best teams basically press high now, but what differentiates them is what they then try to do as soon as they win the ball.
Okay. So Man City is more interested in maybe controlling it, looking for a better shot. Liverpool is just going to try to get a shot before the defense can set.
Yeah, for the most part, because in a similar way, they're also like very confident in their ability to then win the ball back if the through ball from Trent Alexander-Arnold doesn't work out.
Right. So, I mean, if you are a young soccer player, it seems like your optimal strategy is to be technically skilled enough to, be the best in the world there, but you also have to be an enormously amazing athlete to play this high pressing style. Like you really need both in the modern world.
Yes, if if everyone adopts this way of playing, yes, I think that's
Interesting.
accurate. But I mean, I think it's. I don't want to say that there's like not a place for incredibly creative, not quite as athletic players, because I think that there still is. Because think about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You win the ball in this pressing situation. One of the things, Jurgen Klopp, the Liverpool manager, has said that pressing is basically the best playmaker that you can have because it creates
Right.
easier lanes to pass through. But still, like if you are a player that has the vision to take advantage of that space, you're going to be, even if maybe your true value, right, is that you can break down a set defense, you're also going to be a lot better than the average player at taking advantage of like a bigger gap in the defense, right? So I think there's probably like a baseline of athleticism required to fit into a team that plays like this, but I think you can still like it's about finding ways to maybe I think teams are finding ways to say you have this incredibly skilled player but he's maybe not quite as athletic. Teams will be they're more creative in finding ways to fit that player on the field and having it not like destroy the press or something like that. So
Sure.
um, I think I don't want to like suggest that like just like become an awesome athlete and that's how you're going to succeed at soccer, because like these transitional moments that you're trying to take advantage of, you still have to be incredibly technical to take advantage of them and like know where to play the pass and then play a 1-2 and get through the defense. So I think I think athleticism is becoming more and more important since the like days of the where everyone was copying Barcelona and just trying to have 70% possession.
Right.
But, even as we're saying this, right, like if everyone becomes more athletic, like the guy that can step on the ball and slow the game down is probably going to become more valuable as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ryan, there's this thing called the World Cup starting in a few weeks. I took a look at the betting markets yesterday, and the favorite is Brazil, followed by Argentina, France, then Spain, England, and Germany. Do you have any thoughts on this list, and who do you think should maybe be the favorite, and who is a dark horse that could win this?
Yeah, I think Brazil should definitely be the favorite. They've lost one game since the last World Cup, and that was the Copa America final against Argentina.
Yeah. Right.
Which is behind closed doors, and we kind of, I don't know, the closed door soccer. A lot of weird stuff happened then, and I think could probably do a whole other podcast about like whether there's any predictive value in anything that happened during that era.
Interesting.
So they basically lost one game. Then they lost to Belgium in the quarters of the last World Cup, and they might have lost one or two other games since their manager Chiche took over in 2016. I don't have the exact number, but they're basically conceding like 2 goals per year since he's been the manager. Right. They just happen to like lose 2 very high profile games. So they're like maybe not considered as dominant as Brazil teams of the past, but they still have such an insane amount of attacking talent. Plus they have this incredible defensive record. They're missing Brazil has always had amazing fullbacks, but as happens in national soccer, you can't control like who's born when or who's born where.
Right.
So like now they don't have good fullbacks, but they have an insane amount of depth everywhere. I think they have Alisson, who's the best keeper in the world. Ederson, Manchester City's keeper, is their backup keeper. They have a ton of center backs, great defensive midfielders. So I think they've just been like on a tear. As I said, they've lost one game since the last World Cup. So I think in terms of trying to, I mean, I know you've tried to do this. It's pretty hard to project international soccer because the players are changing all the time. It's a different environment. The teams don't play each other that much, and there's so few games. But like in terms of the things that we do have sort of concrete information for, I think Brazil, they literally check every box you could look for in terms of what a dominant international team would be. And then basically after Brazil, it's like I'm not confident in anyone else, I would say.
Interesting. So the Brazil versus Argentina in the Copa America final, I mean, Brazil completely dominated that match. Argentina gets one goal on a counterattack. I think it was Di Maria. And all the headlines after the game, rightfully so, are, Messi finally gets his title, and good for him. We all love Leo Messi. And
yeah, Argentina lost in the finals where they dominated too. So they got one, back.
Exactly. So he gets one, but yeah, like I don't think I don't know. I don't think I ever looked up the XG on that game, if anyone ever has it. But it was a little bit flukish. But just
13
real quick.
shots for Brazil, 6 for Argentina, to go back to our shots conversation from earlier.
Yeah. But real quick, why do you think there's less predictive value in some of these international matches that happen behind closed doors?
Not even just international. I think the Premier League as well, and it's maybe not even closed doors. It's like you look at the data for the Premier League, and like it was different. The sport was different. Like the amount of pressing was down. The number of passes completed were up by a significant degree. So it was a much more slower and kind of measured game. And I think you saw some kind of Manchester United came in second, right? And then they were terrible the next season with all the same players plus Cristiano Ronaldo. So I think you saw a lot of kind of weird. Chelsea fired their manager mid-season, win the Champions League. Liverpool, I mean, again, I guess Liverpool maybe not the best example, but they completely collapsed halfway through the season. So I think a lot of weird stuff happened then. So I wouldn't say there's no predictive value, but I do kind of, I'm not a modeler. I don't do those things, but I feel like the weight put on those games should maybe be a little less than the weight put on a kind of games when the world was normal. Because I think it's clear there's been some studies on various things that you would think that the refs affect or fans could have an effect on. And I think there was a very clear effect in soccer, though, of not having fans. Some of the various things that typically fans would affect, like basically fouls and cards given out by refs, I believe, didn't happen as much without fans in the stands.
Absolutely. I mean, I used a lot of soccer data to figure out that home field advantage was essentially cut in half when there were no fans during the pandemic. So soccer was actually very useful, and that actually directly impacts the cards and the fouls, right?
Yep.
Because the refs, the research suggests that the refs are subconsciously biased towards the home team just because they're in that atmosphere. You get less of those, and it was also interesting that the home field advantage was not zero. So there's still an impact of sleeping in your own bed and not having to travel, and on the players, knowing the environment, that really helps. And I've actually done some stuff recently that shows that, in the NFL, you have a much smaller home field advantage in division games because you see that team every year. You know that environment every year. And the home field advantage is less than a point in division games in the NFL, which is kind of crazy.
That's interesting.
If you haven't thought about it, you'd think that home field advantage in football is 3 points. It's not overall. It's way less than that as home field continues to decrease.
I don't know if this is still true, but a couple of years ago, when it seemed like home field advantage was starting to decline, I guess in the NFL or maybe in all sports, that wasn't true in MLS, which I thought was interesting because MLS teams don't have the same sort of travel accommodations as NFL teams. So, I think it would be interesting to go back and look at it, but you almost have you're controlling for one variable there, right? You don't have the amazing sort of chartered flight situation as often as NFL teams have. So, if there's the divide between the two, maybe you could attribute some of it to that. But yeah, that was a couple of years ago, but it might be interesting to look into it again.
No, absolutely. One of my things, so in my old code for World Soccer, I have a home field advantage of, I think, 0.56 goals. And this was something that I did over a decade ago. So sometime over the next week, I will update that number and we should get a much better estimate. My guess is that it's 0.4. I would almost certainly think that number has decreased.
So when you're doing that, are you like cutting out those COVID games where the home field
Yeah.
advantage like changed, cutting it out completely?
I will I will definitely cut out COVID games where there were zero fans in the stands. And then I think you can get a big enough sample by just looking at World Cup qualifying games.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know in Europe and South America they play home and homes,
Mm-hmm.
and that actually gives you a really good estimate of home field advantage because with the home and home, you're essentially pulling out the. If you think about it, you're pulling out the distinction between how good a team like Brazil versus I don't know who's the worst team in South America, whoever the worst team in South America is,
Venezuela,
because you're
not
playing
Venezuela, Bolivia.
Bolivia. But
Sorry,
because you're
Bolivia.
going home and away, right? Like Brazil should probably kill Bolivia in Bolivia,
Yeah.
assuming they can deal with the altitude and whatnot, right?
Well,
So they
yeah,
should
but
still
then you
win
get
three
into
nothing.
like the idea that like the home field advantage in South America and sometimes is like a crazy altitude situation, right? And that's just not going to be the average. Like the average team isn't going
True.
to have that. So,
Yeah.
it's interesting. Very
Yeah,
interesting.
we'll see how much care I can take
Yeah.
doing this calculation before next Sunday, but I'll have a number for you
Cool.
for sure. We talked about some of the other teams. Maybe you said you didn't have any faith amongst teams not named Brazil. Maybe give us a team that you're at least intrigued in watching and maybe has a high ceiling that could potentially win it all.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like dark horses, like this isn't really. It's kind of a cheating dark horse to pick, because you have the what? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You have the 9 kind of big teams, in my opinion, right? You got Brazil, Spain,
Sure.
Argentina, France, Portugal, England, Belgium, Netherlands, and
Mm-hmm.
Germany. And then Denmark, I think, in most betting markets is the team right outside of that. But I think Denmark are a pretty decent dark horse pick, which is like I'm cheating by picking the dark horse with the best odds,
No,
basically.
that's not cheating. That's smart.
It's smart, exactly. Your baseline, your prior should be that the betting market is accurate, right, in terms of making predictions, I guess. But so Denmark made the semis of the Euros, and this is after their best player Christian Eriksen almost died on the field and didn't play the rest of the tournament. They took England to extra time. They really got absolutely annihilated by England by XG. They just were lucky to get it to extra time. But like the game was in Wembley in England. So they made it to the semis there. They're going to have Ericsson back for this. And there, in my book, I get to the idea that like Denmark is almost the like brain center for the most innovative sort of data forward thinking about soccer. So Denmark is like going to have their sort of set piece program. It'll be like the best one probably at the tournament, and set pieces are going to be super important. They also showed an ability to play sort of like a club team. Like they're kind of able to press high and possess the ball, which like most national teams can't do, or when they try to do it, it ends in disaster, like we saw with Germany and Spain, both at the last World Cup. So, I think like I could see Denmark, like most underdogs, right? You're kind of just like banking on the randomness of soccer at some point, right? Like, yeah, of course, like anyone can beat anyone in one soccer game. But Denmark, I feel like Denmark are the team where they could like, I don't think this will happen, but like if Denmark outplays every team they play, creates better chances than everyone, it wouldn't shock me if that happened. And I think it's rare for there to be an underdog with kind of that capability. So, and I think we are probably overdue for an underdog to win. Like it's still wild to me that only it's 7 teams have won the World Cup, given that it's like designed to be incredibly random. And then you throw in like, so there's kind of like Bill Connolly, who you've probably had him on your podcast before.
Yep.
If not,
Yep.
you should.
Yeah.
He kind of looked into kind of this like 5,000 minute kind of red line in terms of players that played 5,000 minutes before an international tournament. And basically before the last World Cup, there was like 2 players basically that played 5,000 minutes in the season before. Then before the last Euros, it was like 30 because of the increased games due to COVID. And I looked into it a month or 2 ago, and there's just like an insane number of players that are going to be over 5,000 minutes. And guess what? It's all players on the best teams, because those are the guys that play for the teams that are like in the title race the whole season. So all their starters are always playing. They're in the Champions League. They're making it far in all the league tournaments. And then they're playing for their national teams. So I think like and it's a mid-season World Cup. So I think there could be some like drag on the big teams potentially. I don't know. I wouldn't like be confident that's going to happen, but I think it's possible that there could be drag on the big teams because of fatigue. And like Denmark has a lot of players on those teams, but they don't have the like Virgil van Dijk tore his ACL for Liverpool, came back last year, played I think it was almost 6,000 minutes, more than any player in Europe. And he's played every minute of Liverpool's season this season so far. And Liverpool have played the max number of games of any club team so far this season. And like Denmark, they don't have a player like that, right? So I think, there's all kinds of like narratives that kind of fit Denmark potentially overachieving.
Right. And Andreas Christensen, the center back / midfielder for them, hurt himself playing for Barcelona, but he actually played a game. He actually got back on the field, so it looks like he should be okay for them heading into the World Cup. Ryan, have to ask you about the U.S. men's national team. I really love the talent on this team.
Do you have to ask me? Okay. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I do. I do, actually. I do.
I know you do.
So I've been excited about the talent of this team over the last 4 years. You just count up the number of players that are playing on Champions League teams in Europe. So, there's cause for excitement. Also, they look terrible in their 2 friendlies in empty stadiums last month, which kind of put a sour taste in everyone's mouth. But what do you think about this team?
My friend Mike Goodman has said that there's 2 kinds of national teams. There's the national team where the fans are mad at the team and they don't realize it, but they're mad at the team because the players aren't as good as they want them to be. And then there's the other group, which the fans are mad that all their good players aren't playing as well as they want them to be. And I think the U.S. was, for most of its history, in the first category. And I think they now are potentially in the second category, which is a good thing. But I think it kind of to do some kind of level setting, like, remember how I said, like, Brazil's the only team I have any faith in? Like most national teams, like, they have very bad vibes around them currently. Like Argentina they're like flying high and they've shot up the boards in terms of their odds, which we could get into that. But like Spain, France, Portugal, England, Belgium, Germany, they all are like not feeling like they're in a good way right now. They all have kind of underachieved in the Nations League. Famously, Italy didn't even qualify for the World Cup after winning the Euros and looking like maybe the best national team in the world. So like disappointment is kind of that's where things typically are for the national team, because it's really hard to create like a cohesive performance level, no matter how good your players are, because like they barely ever play together. So I think that's important to state for kind of the expectations for the U.S.
For sure.
I think I'm not convinced by the coaching of the team. I don't think coaching is like the be all end all, but I think like, to me, I kind of see a team that is trying to sort of press high and then possess the ball. And I don't think you can really achieve that in the international game unless you're Spain and you have Luis Enrique, who's one of the best coaches in the world. And you have like a culture of Spanish soccer where every player could control a ball in a phone booth, or Germany, where like they've been Bayern Munich is the dominant team. Most of the good players in Germany play for Bayern or Dortmund. So like there's kind of a built-in consistency that those teams have that the US just doesn't. They have a lot of really good players, but everyone plays for different teams that play different styles. So I'm not convinced that the way that they've tried to play, at least in a lot of these games, is the right one. I think maybe a slightly more conservative style that tries to hit teams on the counter. I feel like they have a ton of players that are really incredible in open space and could be really deadly, and like produce games where they have less of the ball, but they create better chances than their opponents. Not even like, hoping a bounce goes your way, but like be the better team, but just in a different way. So I think that I have that kind of concern with the team, but ultimately I think it's like, I don't know, the US is like roughly probably the 16th-ish best team. If you kind of look at like their like this website Transfer Market has these crowdsourced transfer valuations for players, which are like not super accurate, but it's a decent guideline to the talent of the team. The US has the 16th most valuable like 23-man player pool. They're right above Mexico and ahead of Senegal, or behind Senegal, I believe. So like, if you're the 16th best team, what should your expectation be? You should get out of the group, but also like, if you're the 16th best team, your odds of getting out of the group are like probably still less than 50% because there's 4 teams in a group. And then like a run to the quarterfinals is in play. And then if the draw goes your way, maybe the semifinals. So I don't know. I think like it's the most likely outcome is probably that the US doesn't get out of their group, which I think is true. Would be true if you're the 16th best team in the tournament. But also like the US is probably the second favorite to get out of their group. That's just kind of the probability situation. So that's all basically level setting for the team. But that's kind of how I view them from like a high level, I guess.
My numbers have the U.S., I think, exactly 16th. So it would agree with everything that you are saying. And I think when you are the 16th best team in the world and you want to play a possession style game, it's something that you can do against lesser competition. And the U.S. can do that in CONCACAF. And then if you try to do that against Germany, you're going to get killed because they can simply do it better than you.
Yep.
Right. And so, yeah, I think the strategy would be interesting. I mean, you do take a little bit. I did enjoy seeing that the U.S. with not their full squad against the Mexico squad that was clearly better than them did try to sit back and counterattack.
Yeah. And I mean, they did like their game in Mexico City. They did this too, and they were fantastic, and they should have won the game. So like they have shown the capability, and there's like a weird, if you take this line of thinking too far, you can convince yourself, well, the US is better against good teams, which is just not true. That's not how soccer works. But like in some ways, like you are sometimes forced to play without the ball, right? Like if you don't have it, you just don't have it, right? And you have to like take advantage of whatever space is there. So I think, there's a chance that like they, in some games, get forced into playing the style that's maybe slightly more optimal for the team.
Yeah, we shall see. So they're in a group with England, Wales, and Iran. They are not as good as England. They are probably better than Wales. Yes. And they should beat Iran. So really, they open with Wales, and if you get 3 points there, that's a good thing, and you most likely go through.
Right? I think 3 points from that game is you're set up really well. But yeah, I mean, it just gets back to the kind of the uncertainty of international soccer. It's like, Gareth Bale's been playing for LAFC. I've seen him sprint once all season, and it was after he scored the tying goal to celebrate in MLS Cup against the Union. But like, and Gareth Bale hasn't. He was really good for Tottenham 2 years ago. He didn't really do anything this past season for Real Madrid. So if you're like using data to predict future performance, you wouldn't be rating Gareth Bale super high. But like he seems to only care about the World Cup, right? And there's a chance that Gareth Bale like is the old Gareth Bale for one game against the US. And that's a very tricky situation for the US to deal with, because then Wales have by far the best player on the field, which, doesn't matter as much in soccer because there's 11 players. But it's like this kind of the team that like if the US wants to press and possess the ball, Gareth Bale on the counterattack is a very scary proposition, I think.
Absolutely. How old is Bale now?
I think he's a year older than me, so 35, I believe.
Okay, that's getting up there.
You're younger, so he's fresh. You're younger than me. No, he's 33.
Okay.
33, but like has been very injury prone for his entire career, but is like one of the greatest athletes in soccer history also. So
right. Ryan, at some point on a broadcast during the World Cup, we're going to see the letters XG. This is a concept in soccer analytics that you talk about in your book. Can you give everyone who's listening just a brief primer on what expected goals is and what you should get from that?
Yes. So expected goals is basically you can use historical data to determine the likelihood of every shot being converted into a goal. So I like to describe it this way. If you're shooting from midfield, it might be worth, let's say, 0.01 at best. And if you're shooting from the end line, from the goal line with no keeper in the way, it's probably 0.99 because you could always trip, right? Something could happen. And then everything else is somewhere in between. And so you can use this to basically determine which team created the better chances in a game. And throughout soccer history, you've heard managers talking about who created the better chances. And soccer is an incredibly random game over, not just one game, but 10 games. It's very random. So it's kind of a better predictor of future success and a better judge of the quality of your team. And kind of one of the things that, from the creation of the stat, the reason people use it and it's become a thing teams deploy to make decisions is because most teams and most players will regress toward their XG over time. So what this tells you about soccer is that the teams and players that score the most goals mainly score them because they're really good at getting into high value spots to take a lot of shots. There's only a small percentage of goal scoring is comes from your ability to actually kick the ball into the goal. Like everyone that's a professional soccer player has a baseline level of skill that what differentiates the great goal scorers from the not great goal scorers are just the volume and quality of the shots they get, not the actual conversion of the chances, which does kind of upend some traditional soccer wisdom a little bit. So you'll see this a lot at the World Cup, but it's almost like, if anything, like at the World Cup, it's just going to show you how cruel international knockout soccer is, right? Like the US plays Wales, they might create, let's say, 2.1 XG and concede, 0.9 and lose the game 2-1. And you're kind of like, what are you going to do? That's just like the bounces didn't go your way. So that's kind of, it's, I don't know. It's a fantastic stat that I think is really useful, but in the World Cup, it might be like kind of cold comfort for a lot of fans and teams in some ways.
Absolutely. Ryan, always love to end with some potentially non-sports questions. What's your favorite book?
Ooh, favorite book? That changes by the day, I would say.
By the day? I like it.
Yeah, if you ask me tomorrow, my mind might change. It's cloudy in Los Angeles, so my mindset's different. Let's say Say Nothing, this book by Patrick Radden Keefe. It's about the Troubles in Ireland. He's one of my favorite writers, I guess, because it's cloudy out. I'm in a little more of like a salty mood. So just fantastic, reads like fiction, nonfiction book that I recommend to everyone.
Is it about the political situation in Ireland?
Yeah, but it's centered on a handful of characters, from the 60s or 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Awesome. Very cool. So Ryan, what about you live in LA, as you just told us. How about your best culinary experience?
Okay, so this has nothing to do with LA, but I went.
That's good too.
I went whitewater rafting when I was in 6th grade. And the first day, you don't really know what to expect. You don't know what happens when you go whitewater rafting. And we're on the river for 12 hours or something. And you get really cold as a 12-year-old sitting in really cold water for 12 hours. And there was tomato soup that the people running the tour made. And they had ready for us when the day finished. And it was the greatest food I've ever tasted because of the context. So if you could torture yourself by freezing for 12 hours on the Colorado River and have someone make, I don't even know if it was particularly good tomato soup, but I have
exactly.
It's one of those moments where I remember every sensory detail. I remember exactly from that moment.
Yeah. Could have been out of a can. Could have been.
Yes. It might not have even been tomato soup. It might have been something else. Who knows? But it was delicious and so satisfying.
That sounds amazing. If you could have dinner with any one person, dead or alive, who would it be?
Ooh, I think I would just pick or I shouldn't say just pick. I'd pick my dad's dad, my grandpa, who I mentioned my other grandpa who kind of got me into soccer, and I was at all my games when I was a kid. My dad's dad passed away when I was 4 or 5. I remember my vivid memory of him is he would ask me to name the entire New York Knicks roster every time I saw him. And he thought it was like amazing that this 5-year-old kid could just like name John Starks, Patrick Ewing, Charles Smith, and all those people. But I didn't, I don't have that many memories with that grandpa. So I think having dinner with him and just like talking would be incredible. So
I feel that would be a great person to tell about your new book and all the research that you did into soccer, right?
Yeah, I could try to convince him to buy the book, boost the sales.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know. I feel like that's how I would have been growing up, as a little kid, like sitting in my room listening to the Sixers games on the radio because for whatever reason I couldn't get them on the TV, knowing like the roster like that. That would have been me back then too.
Yeah, just naming off random players and making your grandpa laugh. It's a funny situation.
Ryan O'Hanlon, thank you so much for joining me on the Football Analytics Show. Please let everyone know where they can get your book and then also where they can find you on the internet.
Yeah, the book, as you said earlier, it's called Net Gains: Inside the Beautiful Games Analytics Revolution. You can literally buy it anywhere. Your small local independent bookseller might not have it on shelves, but you could call them. Big bookstores should have it. And then I don't have a preference for where anyone buys it. Wherever you typically buy your books online, you can find it. And then I'm at ESPN. We'll be writing throughout the World Cup. And then if you want to follow me on Twitter, if Twitter still exists in the near future, I'm at.
I think it'll exist.
Yeah, well, it'll exist if I'm there doing anything.
We'll gotcha.
See if you'll be able to find anything I'm tweeting, stuff like that. I'm at RWOHAN at Twitter.
Ryan, thanks again for your time.
Thanks for having me. A lot of fun.
This is Ed Fang, your host for the Football Analytics Show. I really hope you enjoyed that conversation with Ryan O'Hanlon. I really love the book, Net Gains. It is about both soccer and analytics, and I think anyone interested in either of those topics will get a lot out of this book. Would also make a great Christmas present, and as Ryan mentioned, you can get it just about wherever you get books. Just a reminder, you can get my free sports betting newsletter. Check that out at thepowerrank.com. There will definitely be some content on the World Cup over the next month. Once again, that's thepowerrank.com. This podcast is also supported by listeners like you through Patreon. At the $5 per month level, you get my sincere thanks and also a patron-only episode every month. If you decide to support the podcast, there's an episode about Green Bay and Tampa Bay and NFL passing metrics waiting for you right now. At the $10 per month level, you get everything at the lower levels and also the Establish the Pass mug when you sign up. I've gotten a lot of compliments on this mug, and it's the same one I drink my coffee out of. There's also a third tier if you really want to engage in football analytics. To support the Football Analytics Show, go to patreon.com/footballanalytics. Patreon is Patreon. Football Analytics is all one word. Once again, my name is Ed Fang. I'm honored to be your host for the Football Analytics Show, and I will talk to you again next week.